The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, I must apologise because my webcam seems to have broken. So you kind of get a discombobulated voice from me and you get Hannah's presence. But thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Suzanne and I'm a director in the Social Research Institute. So over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, my colleague Hannah and I are going to outline how the different generations have been experiencing the pandemic. So what their anxieties have been, and also how this has affected their behaviour. We appreciate that there may be questions, so please do send in a message via the webinar app or through email. We might not have time to get to them today in the session, but we will get back to you. Throughout our presentation, we're going to drill down into the experiences of the baby boomers and Gen Z, so the oldest and the youngest generations that we have data for. Lots has been written about these two groups, including by us. We've added to all that literature, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with stories about how baby boomers have stolen young people's futures, how Gen Z could afford a mortgage if only they stopped buying avocados. We think we know that these groups, stereotypes abound, but let's see how well we do. Just by way of introduction, before we go any further, we were told at the outset that this pandemic was going to be a great leveler, that we would experience this public health crisis in a shared and communal way. Some of you may have seen it when it aired back on April the 9th, and if you haven't, do look it up. But Emily Maitlis, in an introduction to Newsnight, put pay to this myth far more eloquently than I can do now. Suffice to say that the coronavirus has done very little levelling, rather it's just exacerbated existing fault lines and inequalities, and not just generational ones either. So to shine a light on a few examples, we know from our survey work that women are, on the whole, having a very different lockdown experience to men, with the burden of combining paid work, childcare and domestic labour falling disproportionately on them. One of the reasons explaining this might be found in the responses to this question. So men are more than twice as likely as women, that's 15% compared to 6%, to say that their workplace remains unchanged. And 1 in 3 women say that their workplace has closed completely because of coronavirus, compared to just 1 in 4 men. This may be well due to the different types of work that men and women traditionally do, but the upshot is that there are more women at home, meaning there are more women shouldering the burden of homeschooling and domestic labour, as well as all their other responsibilities as well. And the different ways in which men and women are working through the pandemic matters. In this survey we did in collaboration with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership for International Women's Day way back in March, we found that in normal circumstances, a similar proportion of men and women work at home regularly. But the difference is that 4 times as many think that this is damaging to women's careers. 15% say this compared to just 3% for men. So the pandemic isn't levelling off any gender inequalities. And we also know that there are stark and horrifying differences in terms of ethnicity as well. A case in point here is the death rate, which is disproportionately affecting BAME people and in particular Black people.
And there's evidence that these types of differences also play out when we look at the generations and how each of them are experiencing the pandemic. But just to begin, it's worth reminding ourselves what we mean by generations and who they are. And Ipsos MORI, when we talk about generations, we don't necessarily mean generation as in intrafamilial generations, as in a family tree, daughter to mother to grandmother. As social researchers, we use generations or cohorts as an analysis tool. Essentially, generations are an imprecise but incredibly useful grouping of people by the year they were born. And we can use that to analyse changes in society and even predict the future. And Ipsos MORI, we've been looking at generational differences and similarities for about 10 years now, with recent work focusing on some of the younger generations, Gen Z and Millennials, and at the other end of the spectrum, the older generations. And in our report Perennials, we looked at these as well as the ageing process. So broadly, there are 5 distinct generations or cohorts identified today, which I'll talk through briefly. Usually at this point, I'd ask for audience participation and for people to raise their hands when they see their generation. But as unfortunately distance separates us, maybe just silently raise a hand or glass to yourself. So firstly, there's the pre-war generations, actually a combination of what are known as the greatest and the silent generations born broadly around the First and Second World War retrospectively. So this group were born between 1945, born before 1945, and are currently 76 years or older. Baby boomers, 1945 and 1965, currently 55 to 75 years old. We focus on baby boomers particularly throughout this presentation as they represent an age group approaching or already in retirement age. Gen X, born between 1966 and 1979, so 41 to 54 years old. Unfortunately, an often overlooked generation as they're kind of sandwiched between baby boomers and millennials who seem to get all the press, which is a real shame because they are extremely interesting generation in their own right. Millennials, born 1980 to 1995, so 25 to 40 years old. And even now, we still hear of the term millennials being used as a synonym for young people, when the reality is, and I can say this as I'm as a millennial myself, but you know, they're fast approaching middle age now. And finally, Gen Zs are babies, born 1996 and later, so 24 years and younger. With most still under 16, you know, a lot of the data and findings are still emerging for them, but there's lots we can say about them. And Gen Z, in particular, those aged 18 to 24, are also the main focus today, along with baby boomers. So how do we use generational analysis? Well, mainly we use them to try and unpick as much as we can the three different influences that can explain the nature of change in society. And this is period effect. So when people's behaviors or attitudes are influenced by what's going on in the world. So large external events or changes like economic recessions, technological change, they will impact on or mirror across all the generations, no matter how old they are or when they were born. Life cycle effects, where people's attitudes and behaviors change as they age or by what stage they are in their life. And you would expect people's attitudes to change as they get older. For example, you would expect a young person who's just finished school, either about to go to work or further education, which is our Gen Z, would think or act differently to an older person, perhaps entering into retirement. And then finally, the magic cohort effect, where people's attitudes and behaviours are influenced by when they were born, and when generations have unique characteristics which set them apart from other generations. If you find them and you can isolate them, at least to some extent, they can help you predict the future, because these characteristics will be more likely to stick with generations even as they age. So in order to try and unpick some of these impacts or societal behaviour and attitude, you need years and years worth of data. So obviously data on coronavirus, even though it feels like it's been years and years, actually only relates to a couple of months worth of data. That they're snapshots in a relatively short period of time. So as such, a lot of what we may find actually relates more to each generation's age or time of life. So it's also worth talking through some of the generational context as we can view some of this coronavirus data, which is absolutely fascinating, through the lenses of the generational background as well. So I want to introduce you to the two main generations we'll be comparing throughout the presentation today. There's lots and lots I could say, but I just want to pick out some very key background facts that will be helpful, perhaps when we look through some of our polling data. So Gen Zs, I mean, obviously the first point to raise is technology. They're the first generation that's grown up at such a young age with the sort of type of interconnected, sophisticated technology that we have. And this impacts on their behavior. You know, they spend so much more time on the internet, more time on devices than any other age group. And they spend more time communicating. About a third of their device time is spent communicating on social media and so on. And although there's a great many positives to this, there is a growing base of evidence on correlation between certain types of tech use among young people and certain metrics around negative mental health and well-being. And in some respect, they're more mild than wild, not living up to the typical image of teenage rebel. We've seen generational declines in lots of different types of typically bad behaviours. So there's been a huge decline in drinking alcohol in the UK from millennials to Gen Z, some forms of drug taking, different crime across Europe. And maybe somewhat sadly, according to some metrics, Gen Z are actually having less sex than millennials when they were a similar age in terms of number of partners and frequency. And despite some of the images you might see of healthy teens, social media, putting pressure on body image, actually That's not yet being borne out in terms of health of Gen Z in the data. There's been no generational improvement in childhood obesity in the UK, and only about 1 in 10 of Generation Z children are actually meeting recommended levels of activity. And there's some emerging evidence that Gen Z will or are following in the same sort of patterns we saw with millennials due to the difficulties in hitting adulthood during economic downturns. They're more likely to live at home with parents for longer, have less stable employment, and have lower wages comparatively compared to previous generations when they were young. And in terms of baby boomers, well, they're not actually as traditionalist as we might think. Certainly on older liberal issues like gay marriage or women's equality, actually there's not much or pretty much no difference between the general opinion of baby boomers and millennials and even Gen Z. And that's because baby boomers have seen monumental societal changes in their lifetime. The landscape they were born into on issues such as LGBT rights or gender issues just look totally different now, and they've adapted. And they've also adapted in other ways. The frequency of internet use and device ownership is astronomically increased across all generations, all age groups. And it's true there's still a gap between the youngest and the oldest in terms of volumes of tech use, but it's not as stark as you might think. And older generations recognise the benefits that technology can bring just as much as young people. And you do see the same levels of reliance on internet and tech among some older age groups in some ways. And just as a comparison point to Gen Z, maybe they're more mild than wild. They're aging, and baby boomers at least are in the happiest time of life, and maybe that shows. There's been a generational rise in STI rates among baby boomers compared to pre-war generations. So STI rates among 50 to 70-year-olds have risen by a third in the last decade. And perhaps connected to that, age is relative. They don't view themselves as old. When we ask a 16 to 24-year-old age bracket when old age starts, they say 61. Whereas a 55 to 64-year-old will say that it doesn't start till 72. So, and in our work on perennials, and we looked into some of the implications of this, and there are many, but one of the big ones is that the large proportions of baby boomers are perhaps not saving enough for retirement.
Okay, with that context in mind, let's have a look to see how these two distinct generations are experiencing the pandemic. So right from the very start of the pandemic in the UK, one of the things that we knew about COVID-19 was how older people are much more vulnerable to its effects. If you think back to the weekend before we went into lockdown, then the Prime Minister stated that people should not go and visit their mothers on Mother's Day, and instead the single best present that we can give, we who owe our mothers so much, he said, is to spare them the risk of catching a very dangerous disease. And such messages that older people are more vulnerable and are to be protected have hit home and shaped the older generation's response to the pandemic. So if we look at this chart, which asks people to say what level of threat they think COVID-19 poses to them personally, then it's the oldest generation, the baby boomers, who are twice as likely as Gen Z to say that it's a high threat. Half of all baby boomers think this compared to just 1 in 4 Gen Z. And more generally, the data shows that each successive generation is more concerned about the threat than the last. So the older you get, the more of a worry that getting ill with this actually is. 3 in 5 baby boomers also think that if they contacted COVID-19, that it would seriously affect their health. And again, this is double the proportion of Gen Z. Only 1 in 3 think that it would seriously affect their health. And what's more, the proportion of older people thinking this has increased over the course of the lockdown. So when we were instructed to stay at home on March the 23rd, just 2 in 5 baby boomers thought that COVID-19 would affect their health seriously. And this figure's increased by 19 percentage points to the end of April. In contrast, the proportion of Gen Z who think it would seriously affect their health, well, it's gone up, but by nowhere near as much, by only 8 percentage points. They're just not as concerned about the impact on them. And away from the impact of the pandemic on themselves personally, older generations are also much more concerned about what the pandemic means for the country as a whole. So 4 in 5 baby boomers think that COVID-19 poses a high level of threat for the UK. And that's a figure that's remained relatively stable since lockdown was introduced as well. In contrast, only around 2/3 of Gen Z think the same. If we look ahead to the future too, then baby boomers have also been the least optimistic about when things are going to get back to normal, or rather the new normal as it's being termed. So back in March, we started to ask people the extent to which they agreed that things would be back to normal by June, so now. And as lockdown was introduced, only a quarter of baby boomers agreed that this would be the case. Half the proportion of Gen Z who much more optimistically thought the same. And over the course of the lockdown, as that June deadline's approached, the proportion of baby boomers agreeing with this has reduced. So by the end of April, only 1 in 5 thought that things would be back to normal by the time we got to June, compared to still nearly half of Gen Z who thought that things would right themselves over the following month. But I think where it gets really interesting is when we look at how these attitudes towards the pandemic translate into behaviours. So if we think back to earlier slides, baby boomers identified COVID-19 as a high threat to themselves personally, and they also recognised that it could seriously affect their health. So you'd assume from this that they would do all they could to keep themselves safe. Yet our survey data shows that this hasn't necessarily been the case. At the end of April, over a quarter of baby boomers said that they were not quarantining in their home or shielding, compared to just 1 in 10 of those in Gen Z who were not quarantining or shielding. And if we dig into this in a little bit more detail as well, then we can find 1 in 5 baby boomers who think that COVID-19 poses a high threat to them personally when not quarantining or shielding. The very section of society that we would expect to be at home were not. It's really hard to say why this might be the case for certain, but we know from previous work we've done into generations as part of our report into the perennials, and if you think back to the context slide that Hannah went through earlier in this presentation, that they just don't like identifying as old or weaker. So even though they know rationally that they're at higher risk to the worst effects of COVID-19, the image that they want to project of themselves to the world perhaps stops them behaving in a way that we might expect. If we look ahead to the future, we can also see some generational differences in how people feel about life after lockdown as well, which might help explain baby boomers' pessimism when thinking about how soon things are going to get back to normal, because even though changes to the guidelines will mean that we can do certain things, it doesn't mean that we're going to feel comfortable doing them as well. Where we see baby boomers get particularly uncomfortable is in relation to their future presence in crowded spaces. So only 17% of baby boomers will feel comfortable using public transport after lockdown ends, compared to a quarter of Gen Zers. And only 1 in 10 will feel comfortable going to large public gatherings like sports or music events. Again, this is compared to a quarter of Gen Zers. In contrast, baby boomers are most comfortable with seeing friends and family outside of their households. 2/3 mentioned that they will feel comfortable doing this, compared to just a half of Gen Z, and suggesting that for the older generation in particular, it's this lack of social contact with the people that they love that they're particularly struggling without. But again, we need to think about behaviours, and in spite of these concerns about going to crowded spaces, it doesn't mean that baby boomers plan to adapt their behaviours accordingly. And when it comes to wearing a face mask, well, this has to still yet to tip over into being the norm for all of us. When we look at the population as a whole, only 7% say that they already wear one, with a further third saying it's likely that they will in the future. But if we analyse the response from the baby boomers, then while 1 in 10 already wear one, only 3 in 10 say it's likely that they're going to do so in public in the near future, compared to over 2 in 5 of those in Gen Z. And again, it's hard to say why this is so, but 2 hypotheses here are firstly the mismatch between their actual age and level of risk that carries with it versus how they see themselves and want to be seen. They just, deep down, don't think of themselves as old. And second, this group are still much more trusting of government than other sections in society. So until there's an official line on this from Westminster about wearing face masks in public, then it may not have the salience required for them to actually take action.
I've already flagged at the start some of the context of generational imbalance economically. The generational background is one of economic imbalance between younger and older generations, with millennials and Gen Z in a worse economic position compared to older generations at an equivalent point. And the evidence so far suggests that COVID-19 is potentially compounding this and impacting younger age groups harder. and it's being felt by them. So younger age groups are more concerned about the impact of coronavirus on their financial situations. So here, with each generation in their allotted colour scheme on the right, Gen Z in yellow, Millennials in pink, Gen X in purple, and Baby Boomers in blue, about a third of Gen Z are worried that they will have a job in a month's time, compared to less than 1 in 10 of Baby Boomers there. And across other measures, there's this clear divide on levels of concern between the younger generations, so Gen X and younger, and Baby Boomers. So just as an example, 3 in 10 of Gen Z, Millennials and Gen X are concerned about being able to provide for themselves and their family in a month's time, compared to just 1 in 10 of Baby Boomers. And of course, it's worth flagging that this is connected to life cycle. So Gen X, Millennials, and even some Gen Z now will have younger families and children to care for, provide for. And in some ways, they are right to be concerned. You know, the pandemic has impacted on jobs and finances of all generations in different ways, but it is the younger age groups who seem to be often the hardest hit. So, for example, a quarter or one in 4 of 18 to 30-year-olds in work, so Gen Z with the youngest Millennials, have been furloughed, compared to just about 1 in 5 of Baby Boomers, and 1 in 10 18 to 30-year-olds have actually lost their job, compared to just 1 in 100 Baby Boomers in the past couple of months. And some of the financial behaviours of younger age groups over the past month or so indicate that they might be feeling some of this pinch. So Gen Z are more likely to have said that they've dipped into savings or used overdrafts, taken out new credit cards, or had to borrow money from family and friends, compared to Baby Boomers or older generations in the last month. And this, of course, again, partly due to life stage. Younger people are earlier on in their career, they will have lower salaries, but also within the context of some of that generational imbalance I mentioned earlier, there is less of a cushion here, and that could lead to longer term problems. So, but how are the different generations experiencing the pandemic? What's the lived experience been like for them? Well, in spite of the very different impacts that COVID-19 is having on the different generations, it is still a relatively shared experience, at least for Baby Boomers, Gen X and Millennials, so the older ones. When we ask people how they feel, asking them to choose from a list of different options, all of these 3 generations give very similar top answers. So the top emotion for the older age groups are concern for others, about half saying they can feel concern for those who are vulnerable and weak. But there's also uncertainty, with about a third curious about how coronavirus is going to impact the world, is impacting the world. And around 3 in 10 are actually finding a positive in all this. They're hopeful to see how the environment is improving, with more of us unable to actually get out and about. But Gen Z feel differently. They're mostly bored, and that's actually the top emotion for them, with about 2 in 5 feeling this way. And although they're also uncertain and hopeful, as with the other groups, a quarter are lonely. And both of these emotions factoring so highly in the Gen Z psyche is interesting for a generation which you would assume has the most ability and being used to communicating with other people via social media or entertaining themselves online. And also, if you take that data at face value, then you might say that young people don't give a fig about the vulnerable and weak. That's perhaps a bit unfair. You know, generational volunteering rates among teenagers actually increased. And when you ask people what they've been doing to help others in lockdown, younger people are just as likely to get out and about and help others. But actually, it's maybe just that they're feeling a lot more. If you compare Gen Z with Baby Boomers in particular, Gen Z are just feeling a wider range of emotions and caring about a lot more things. So just for example, you know, they're more likely than Baby Boomers to feel angry or frustrated about lockdown, correlating perhaps with that boredom. They're more worried about their financial job security, not surprising, bearing in mind the last few slides. And they're also happy to spend time with their family. But it's not just the youngest age group that is struggling. Actually, if you ask people whether it's been easier, harder, or about the same to stay positive day to day compared with before the coronavirus outbreak, about half of each generation there say they are finding it harder, with millennials sticking out a bit, 3 in 5 saying it's harder to stay positive. And also younger generations are more likely to be doing a range of activities under lockdown, either doing more of different activities or trying something completely new. So when you're comparing Gen Z with Baby Boomers, they say they're much more likely to have tried a new form of exercise or exercise more compared with late March. They're more likely than Baby Boomers to use social media more than they were. They're more likely to play board games, do puzzles, take up crafts or design, spend quality time with family or friends, and learn a new skill. And even amazingly, considering their generational aversion to it, they're having more sex. And so the types of activities generation are doing more of under lockdown is definitely reflective of life stage. You know, for example, 2/3 of millennials who are more likely to have young children say they're having fun or playing more with their children. And the only activity baby boomers are doing more of compared to Gen Z is gardening, again, perhaps reflective of age. But ultimately, the impact of these kind of differences in behaviours and attitude by age is uncertain in different ways. But in terms of whether different age groups will look back on the government with a kind eye, well, despite differing comfort levels in terms of returning to normal, the majority across all age groups think government acted too late. And this is particularly true of the more middle-aged groups, with around 7 in 10 thinking the government acted too late in response to coronavirus. And only about a quarter across the generational groups think government measures were taken at the right time. And in terms of what we want for the future, we regularly ask people about what kind of society they would ideally like to live in, whether it's a more collectivist society on the top left there, one that emphasises the social and collective provision of welfare, or on the right, a more individualistic society, one that encourages the individual to look after themselves. Comparing historically, there has been a slight societal shift so across the age group since the outbreak towards a collectivist standpoint, but the age breakdown shows that this is particularly so for the younger generations, with higher proportions of Gen Z, millennials, seeing an ideal society as collectivist, about 3 in 5, compared to just half of Gen X and baby boomers. And just to leave you with a few closing thoughts from the data, age is relative, so is vulnerability. Not everyone who is in the older age group or the vulnerable group will think of themselves as so. You know, in the long term, particularly as we think about opening up or releasing social distancing restrictions, it's just not going to cut it for everyone to tell those who we think are older or more vulnerable that they need to follow different rules. It's important to understand people's perceptions and how they think of themselves when we're trying to work out what will work in terms of behavioural nudges. And the sharp, hopefully short, shock of coronavirus on finances is harder for younger generations already, and they're already on the back foot in terms of financial stability. It is likely we will see a longer term reverberations for them. And thirdly, social media is no substitute for personal interaction, even for a generation that up until now many thought just socialised only or primarily through social media. And there will be a new normal after this, there definitely will, but so far our data shows that that age divide based on who feels safe in what circumstances and what type of change they want will mean there's perhaps a different new normal for different people. And finally, you know, maybe it took a lockdown and a global pandemic, but young people are finally having a bit more sex. Thank you. And just to reiterate what Sue said at the beginning, sorry you can't see her and we don't have time for questions now, but please do write it in the questions box, or you can email us there. Our email's on the screen. So that's hannah.shrimpton and suzanne.hall@ipsos.com. Get in touch with any questions and we'll continue on a conversation offline. Thank you and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.